Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning if you're joining us from Singapore. My name is Nick Flude. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at Sekuro, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of our Sekuro Knowledge webinars, which we will aim to do on a monthly basis. Apologies for any of the technical challenges that we had earlier. Ignore the first kind of couple of emails that came out. There was a big red button on the screen that said do not press, and we had to press it, and now we know what that does. So apologies. You will get the review and the recording of the session as we kind of complete. So as I said, this is the first of our knowledge webinars. The topic for today is everything you want to know about internal pen testing but were afraid to ask, and you'll be hearing in a moment from Riley Kidd, who's a principal consultant. There are some things to note. We're going to aim for about 25 minutes with Q&A at the end. Your mics will be muted, but if you do want to ask a question, then you can use the panel on the left-hand side just to raise a hand, or you can chat through the chat window. This session is being recorded and it will be sent out once it's completed. And if you do have any follow-up questions, then feel free to send them through to engage@sekuro.io, particularly if you have any questions about anything that Riley raises or that you have any topics for future knowledge webinars. So without further ado, it is over to you, Riley.
So yeah, thanks Nick. My name's Riley. So I look after the technical testing team over here at Sekuro. So we perform a whole suite of different kinds of technical testing, some of which are internal penetration tests, and that's going to be the topic of today's discussion. So in this session, we're going to cover the Sekuro internal penetration testing offering at a high level. And if you're interested in more detail, or you want to have one of those more organization specific or a focused or a one-on-one discussion, please just let me know at the end or send an email to that email address that Nick mentioned, and we can organize to have one of those sessions as well. I know Nick already covered it, but if you have any questions or want clarifications, feel free to raise your hand during the session. So I'm happy to answer questions as we go along if they're topical to the piece that I'm talking about, or alternatively waiting till the end. That's also fine as well. So before we dive straight into the internal penetration testing piece, I first want to align on some definitions so that we can avoid any assumptions or any kinds of miscommunications that can come in these kind of very similar but distinct testing types. So first up, I just want to touch on what penetration testing or pen testing actually is, and what some of the outcomes are that we're looking for when we perform these kinds of tests. So pen testing at its core involves executing security-specific tests against different resources using automated and manual techniques. And these resources, they can be internal, they can be external, they can be a whole different types of things like mobile applications, web applications, APIs, Active Directory, different system configurations, a whole suite of different things. And these tests are usually looking to identify any misconfigurations or security vulnerabilities which could be abused by an attacker to gain unauthorized access to that resource or that type of resource. And these vulnerabilities are usually ranked based on that perceived risk or based on their perceived risk, and that's often a function of likelihood and impact. And so that's what a pen test is, but then what about a vulnerability scan? And so a vulnerability scan makes use of automated tools to perform what's usually a high-level security check of a resource. And the results of these tools, they may be manually verified, or depending on the intent or the purpose of the program, they might be assumed to be valid and then used as a baseline for issues and improvement tracking over time, for example. So you might use or have heard of Nessus or Qualys or a tool like that. You might have that in your environment right now, using that to perform vulnerability scanning and issue management. And so a pen test that can include a vulnerability scan, so it can include those kinds of tools, but with broad strokes, a vulnerability scan isn't a pen test. At least, when we're scoping out these kinds of pieces of work, we try to separate those things, and they're usually separated based on the intent or the purpose of the exercise. So that's a generic pen test and a vulnerability scan definition. So I just wanted to get those out of the way first. And then next, we need to go down a bit of a layer deeper into a few of the different types of pen testing. So for example, I mentioned a few examples before. So I mentioned web application pen testing, API pen testing, mobile application pen testing as well. But what about external pen testing? So an external pen test specifically, it usually assesses the security of the external organization's perimeter. So an external pen test will focus usually on any kind of internet accessible assets. So that might be websites, it might be mail servers or VPN services, for example. And an external pen test focuses on those resources which anyone on the internet can access. And therefore, by design, they can also attempt to compromise them as well. And an external pen test will often attempt to abuse resources on that perimeter in order to try to gain unauthorized access to those resources. So things like, for example, default credentials or outdated services and components, or even insecurely configured resources. These are the kinds of things you would expect to see from an external pen test. And you can see this at a high level in the diagram here. So if we think about that traditional sort of castle approach to security of securing the perimeter, we can see some pen testers here who are focusing from that perspective. So they're focusing on the external perspective, and they're trying to assess the services and the configuration of different systems that are behind that perimeter. So then if we think about internal pen testing, which is the focus of this session, on the other hand, an internal pen test that focuses on the internally accessible resources. So an internal pen test will often assess the security of common internal components, so things that are accessible from the internal network, but not necessarily from the external network. So there we focus on things like Active Directory, network share configurations, or segmentation. An internal test could also include vulnerability scans. That's why I also included that definition at the start. But depending on the scope, it might and it might not. So an internal pen test focus really is on what an attacker would be able to do when they're situated on the internal network. So we remove the external component for this. And the kind of questions we're looking to answer here, for example, are, is it possible to escalate privileges? Can a user access systems or data which they shouldn't be authorized or shouldn't be able to access? And so we can see this again in the diagram here, where the testers are now situated on the internal network. So the external perimeter is still sitting there over on the left, but the testers are now on the internal network. And so now they're able to assess the security and the configuration of those different services that are behind that perimeter. So that's the general difference of the internal and the external type of testing. In an external pen test, that testing is performed from the external perspective against those externally facing resources or externally accessible resources, while on an internal pen test, the testing is performed from the internal perspective against the internal resources. So that's sort of the high-level difference. If you've ever done, or if you've never done rather, any sort of real pen testing before, it's likely a good idea to first focus on that external perimeter. So focus on those external pen tests to try to secure and firm up that external perimeter. But if you've consistently performed these external types of tests, if you already have a good understanding of that external perimeter, and you can even sort of predict the findings that you're going to receive from an external pen test before you even receive the report, the next best place to test, or what we would typically recommend as a next maturity step, is to test internally with that internal focus of an internal pen test. During an internal pen test, we'll typically see some common and easy to make misconfigurations that can often lead to complete and sometimes even a trivial compromise of the internal network or the internal domain. even from the perspective of a non-domain joined user or machine, so just anyone with network access to the environment. Often what we see on the internal network is configurations and segmentation. They're just as important as patches and patch management. But what's the benefit? So what's the benefit of doing an internal pen test? So a common question we hear when we have scoping calls or discussions around where to focus efforts for an internal pen test is, well, actually, I don't really know. That's why people have that conversation with us. They're hoping that we can help them answer those kinds of questions. But we hear this answer from a whole range of questions. So things like, how many domain admins do you have? Is the internal network segmented? Is it possible to access the internal network from the internet? Questions like that. For a company with a mature external perimeter, an internal pen test that really helps to answer the sort of what we would classify as the unknown unknowns, or that I don't really know types of answer to those kind of questions, where you sort of hope that people at least have some understanding or some idea of what that looks like from an internal perspective. And the reason for that is because part of the internal pen test process is for us to assess the internal network. And we can use that assessment to help identify those unknown security issues, which can be present in the network. And so Donald Rumsfeld, the late US Secretary of Defense, summarizes this quite nicely. And if we put an IT lens on this, we can sort of think about our known knowns. So that would be our IT risk register, so the problems we know we have and that we're working to solve. We'd also have our sort of known unknowns. So these are the sort of known security gaps with broad strokes that we know exist, where we might have things like security transformations or zero trust implementations in place to try to remediate these kind of problems before they really prop up. And then we have the last category. So those are the unknown unknowns, and this is sort of the blind spot that we potentially have. And these are the things we don't know. And so on the internal network, when we're looking at performing an internal network pen test, these are the kind of unknown unknowns that we're looking to identify, and we're looking to help by reporting them for you to remediate. But what does that actually look like? What actually happens during an internal pen test? So, I mean, at a high level, and depending on the scope of what we're doing, an internal pen test, it's usually broken up into some separate but linked phases. And again, it's all at a high level, but I've tried to classify them here. So firstly, we have the discovery phase, and that's looking to identify information and to try to understand the internal network. So when we're doing discovery, we're trying to identify system locations, understand different tools and utilities that are in use, and also the users who use them. We're also trying to identify what's available to us and what could also be misconfigured. So what kind of tools are being used, what kind of systems are being used, and where in the network are they situated, and are they accessible to us either directly or indirectly. And once that discovery information is available, we start looking at identifying the accessible users, those vulnerable or potentially misconfigured systems or abusable configurations, or even focusing on those important services. And when we're at this point in the internal pen test, we're trying to identify basically what subset of those resources that were discovered in the previous phase appear to be misconfigured. So based on the things that we've seen, based on the things that we've identified, what appears to be misconfigured and potentially exploitable. And so then the next sort of logical phase from that is to start actively trying to abuse those configurations or to exploit them in a controlled way. And the purpose here, or the idea here, is to try to gain unauthorized access to those systems, to the data, within the internal network. So just because some things appear to be misconfigured doesn't necessarily mean that they are. So this point in the process is really is it actually possible for somebody to abuse this practically, or is it more of a theoretical vulnerability? So that's at a high level what an internal pen test would typically involve, or the steps that would be taken. But a question we also get asked is sort of why would we want to do one? Why would you get or have an internal pen test performed? So the reality of IT is that your internal network is exposed to threats. So, for example, some common threats that we see or that we hear about are an external intruder. So those are the people who are trying to breach that external perimeter. So we mentioned that at the start. So those are those people on the internet who are trying to get access to your internal network, trying to bypass your external controls to get access to those internal systems or those internal services. And with working from home, we also see that some organizations have lost some control on who can access that internal network and how. So that the physical restrictions are often less of a concern or less of a restriction. So the scope with more and more people working from home, it becomes wider and wider here. Another common threat is that malicious insider who's looking to gain access to systems or data that they're not authorized to view. And there's different levels of malicious insiders and capabilities. However, this can be as simple as somebody browsing shares that they shouldn't really be able to access and accessing the data in there, through to a bit more of a skilled malicious insider who might be attempting to, for example, compromise the Windows domain. And then we also have a third general classification, and that's for accidental errors. And so these are the kind of layer 8 problems, errors that are made by users. So for instance, temporary access might be given to a system that wasn't revoked, or a user might receive a phishing email and they might be encouraged to click it or to run macros or something like this. And an analogy here is while an external pen test might focus on the technical security of the perimeter, a malicious attacker may instead just focus on the people. So, for example, they might just perform a phishing attack, for example. And it's very hard, or it's relatively hard to send a phishing email to a web server, but it's much easier to send a phishing email to an end user. And we can have a lot of technical control to make this more difficult, but from an attacker's perspective, at least, just for sending phishing emails, it's a very high reward and a low risk task. So what are some of the broad value adds that we see from performing an internal pen test, and why would you want to have one or consider having one performed? An internal pen test can be the next step in the maturity of the organization's security program. So an internal pen test can help identify those new or actionable issues, and they also can help in prioritization and direction. So from the internal network perspective, I mentioned earlier around the secure external component. So if you've already got a good handle on that external perimeter, the internal part of the network can be the next focused area, for example. And another one of the benefits is that the internal pen test that helps you understand the risks behind that external perimeter and can also demonstrate resilience to realistic real-world attacks. So a good common example of this that we see is around ransomware. So people want to understand what happens. We have all these great technical controls and AVs and EDRs and things in place, but what actually happens if that email gets to that person's inbox, or that person's machine at home gets compromised and they connect through the VPN? What's actually going to happen? Are we resilient to ransomware, or is it going to be trivial for an attacker to compromise our internal network? And so if you think you're secure and you want confidence in that internal security, then an internal pen test can help identify any gaps that you're unaware of. If you're looking to verify that controls are effective and not just looking good on paper or in screenshots, for example, that's another area where an internal pen test can help. Similarly, if you want to validate the capability of an outsourced provider and their procurement contract, so you might have an external SOC, for example, an internal pen test can help there. So it's not just actually performing the test, but while somebody's performing the test, what kind of indicators of compromise, what kind of things are occurring in the network which somebody would be able to identify and respond to. Also, if you're looking to understand your exposure to a new tactic, a new technique, or some new procedure. So for instance, a semi-recent vulnerability would be Log4j. So if you're interested, if you had any exposure internally to Log4j, for example, an internal pen test can help you there as well. So basically, an internal pen test can help you identify, prioritize, and ultimately remediate those unknown unknowns that may be present within your environment. So I'm not sure, Nick, if we had any questions there.
Just a question there is, so how long does one take? Might be as long as a piece of string, but how long might an internal pen test take?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you gave a good answer. It depends a lot on the focus area and the value. So I mentioned, for example, that an internal pen test can include a vulnerability assessment, for example. So if your network has 50K machines, then that's going to be a long test, because it's going to take a long time to perform those kinds of scans and also to verify the results. Versus if we're more focused, or we have a bit more of a constrained environment to work in. So for example, you might be really concerned or interested in understanding the security of your AD configuration. Because you've read, some IR reports, and you can see that's a big focus area for ransomware groups or whomever. We can focus our testing on a much more constrained view of the internal network with an outcome focused really more on value. And then those kind of tests can be much shorter. So in the neighborhood of 4 days, for example, through to, a more full-blown red team that can take, 4, 5, 6 months.
So that's potentially leading to the next question, which is the frequency. So how frequently should you run an internal pen test or pen tests?
Yeah, it's a good question as well. Whenever we have, it depends on the organization. So whenever we're having these discussions, we're trying to understand what the value proposition looks like. So for example, if you had an internal pen test 6 months ago and there's been no changes and the changes are sort of in a backlog somewhere, then there's not really any value in having that same pen test performed again. However, if you're on top of those high risk findings, then there can be value in having them performed on an annual basis, or if you have specific concerns. So a new vulnerability might come out. I mean, as we've seen in the past couple of years, that's a consistent thing, and I think it's fair for me to predict a new one will come out. You might be trying to remediate that in your environment, and that might be a single focus area. So you might just want to engage a provider to help you verify that single component's been fixed. Or if you're looking more at the wider piece, then usually about a yearly test is usually about a good finger in the air answer, because the other part of this is that some of the problems that we typically identify in internal pen tests, especially if you haven't had one performed before, the problems are often non-trivial to remediate. So if they're tied down to your Active Directory, for example, it can be a big exercise to rebuild your AD. Can be. It likely will be a big exercise. So some of the high-risk components can be quite tricky to remediate.
Well, that definitely leads into then the next question, which is what type of recommendations do you make after conducting a pen test? For example, defining the things the customer must do either themselves or through a third party, what services that should be purchased, what products to consider.
Yeah, another good one. Usually our recommendations are going to be risk-based. So if I just focus on the report artifact, the typical report artifact that we deliver at the end of an exercise like this, they're going to be prioritized based on perceived risk. So the risk that we see when we perform the test. So typically doesn't include the business risk component, but at least from the technical side, that's how we sort of organize the findings, and also how we recommend that they get remediated in that order. In terms of like services and products and things like that, we don't typically push certain products or services, but we'll make statements around things that we identify that are missing within the environment. So, for example, we might perform a lot of noisy testing in an internal pen test, and that's typically what we will be doing. And by noisy, I mean we'll be making a lot of requests to different systems, querying the domain about users and configurations of services and things like that. And so those kinds of actions are something that, you know, a mature monitoring environment would be able to identify and enable you to respond to. So, for instance, if you had a SOC, or if you don't have a SOC, and we perform our activities for, you know, I mentioned 4 days, for example, if we're in the environment for 4 days doing all these kinds of scans, running all these kind of tools, and nobody notices, then that's something that's going to be a finding. And that's sort of an indirect finding because it's not directly related to the testing that we're doing. But, you know, broader picture, that's something that we really strongly recommend, because on the internal network, as everybody knows, that's where a lot of your sensitive stuff is. And if somebody, you know, is performing these kinds of tests unauthorized, then you want to know about it. So that's sort of a side recommendation that we'll typically make. But, you know, we'll say that we recommend that you have a SOC, or that you centralize your logging, or things like that. We won't necessarily say you use this certain tool and it will solve all your problems, because as far as I'm aware, that tool doesn't exist.
Cool. And then just one last question that's come in. So are there any specific compliance frameworks that state or recommend or enforce an internal pen test, or is it something that is just nice to have or good to have as an organization increases its security maturity?
That would be a great question for one of my GRC colleagues. I'm not sure the answer to that from a compliance perspective.
So there is nobody that has raised their hand or put anything into the chat. So based on that, I will draw this webinar to a close. So thank you very much for everybody that has attended online. Thank you to Riley for putting this together and sharing your kind of knowledge. If anybody does have any follow-up questions or wish to inquire about how we can help, then please email us at engage@sekuro.io. Thank you very much.